The rapid emergence of artificial intelligence and automation is transforming creative workflows and raising questions of authorship and value. Studio attendance remains uneven, and even when students are physically present, attention becomes fragmented, pulled towards phones and laptops. Swipe-based media habits predispose learners to skim rather than dwell, to sample rather than sustain inquiry. As studio learning environments shift towards screen-based modes, the creative process is being compressed, and the predominance of screen-based tools in creative practice risks diminishing tactile literacy. Evidence from studies of university students suggests that repeated exposure to rapid, continuous streams of stimuli that produce immediate rewards through neuroplasticity can reshape how attention and motivation are allocated over time. As the brain becomes attuned to frequent rewards, slower and more effortful activities can begin to feel unrewarding or even aversive. This potentially has implications for creative practice, where difficulty, duration, and uncertainty are integral to the process. The creative studio has historically been a place of proximity, bodies working side by side, learning through observation, gesture, and shared material. Knowledge is not only spoken but enacted, carried in the relationship between hand, eye, and material and each other. As Sheets Johnston reminds us, thinking is not separate from movement, but arises through it as a lived, embodied process. If thinking is fundamentally embodied, then pedagogies that privilege only visual and cognitive processing may become limited. This framework is rooted in somatic learning, mindfulness, and relational pedagogy, and informed by neuroscience, philosophies of non-attachment, and Winnicott's concept of the authentic self. It cultivates presence, self-awareness, and embodied engagement. It extends traditions of action research, where learning develops iteratively through making and reflection, as modes of embodied engagement. Following Green's call to treat the body as both content and method, embodied engagement is understood not simply as the focus of inquiry, but as the means through which inquiry takes place. Muslin's review of embodied cognition suggests that cognitive processes are deeply dependent on sensory motor systems. Within this context, embodied intelligence becomes critical, restoring creative learning as a relational, sensory, and situated practice. This paper argues that an embodied pedagogy is not supplementary, but necessary. It recenters attention within practice and restores creative learning as a felt relational experience to expand creative capacity. Relational pedagogy emphasizes that learning is inherently social and interdependent. Winnicott's idea of the facilitating environment describes a space in which exploration and play can take place safely. Somatic and mindful approaches depend on relational safety. Students are less likely to engage in environments that feel purely performance-driven. The studio, in this sense, becomes a facilitating environment where learning is supported through relationship rather than evaluation alone. This approach to the studio establishes the conditions in which embodied engagement can take place. Somatic learning refers to attentive engagement through tactile creative action. It involves learning through the hands, through material interaction, supported by sustained attention to process. This draws from craft traditions, where knowledge is developed through doing, where tacit knowledge emerges through engagement, often before it can be articulated in language. Neuroscience insights further support the idea that action and cognition operate as an integrated system, that movement plays a primary role in the development of thought. Fine motor skills such as drawing or 3D modeling stimulate neural circuits linked to spatial reasoning, language, and planning. These findings affirm what craft traditions have long known. Our hands are tools of the mind. Building on this knowledge, recent research evidences that the hand does not simply follow thought, it actively participates in its formation, meaning that hand movement produces its own form of engagement, thereby becoming an active participant in perception, cognition, and knowledge production. Therefore, our definition of hands as tools is refined. Our hands are co-authors of. Mindfulness, defined here as attentive making, supports sustained attention within practice. It allows students to notice tendencies such as perfectionism or avoidance, and to remain with the uncomfortable phases of experimentation. The framework also draws on philosophical traditions such as Karma Yoga that promote acting with full attention while relinquishing attachment to results. This invites students to attend to methods of making rather than moving directly towards outcome. Non-attachment does not imply indifference. Rather, it supports wholehearted engagement in the present task while loosening the grip of ego and outcome. Finally, Winnicott's notion of the authentic self provides a psychological lens where creativity is not only the fulfillment of a brief, but a process of becoming more fully oneself. The pedagogical model of doing and being and thinking aligns with traditions of action research and creative practice, where Sean helps explain how practitioners learn through reflection on action. However, the doing, being, thinking framework extends this tradition by proposing that learning also emerges through embodied attention within action itself. Doing and being and thinking are two interrelated modes presented as action words to students, verbs that describe ways of working rather than static categories. Doing refers to actions such as cutting, 3D modeling, assembling, where the hand plays a central role in shaping cognition and imagination. Being refers to the internal state of mindful presence within this engagement. Together they form a unified mode of tactile engagement and awareness. If doing and being emphasize learning through attentive engagement with an action, thinking provides an opportunity to step back and make that learning visible. Thinking is the reflective phase through which experience is articulated, integrated, and extended. It occurs as a deliberate pause from practice, typically at the end of a studio session, so as not to interrupt the flow of embodied engagement. Reflective thinking remains grounded in the evidence of embodied doing and being. It is not detached from practice, but emerges directly from it. In this way, reflection does not replace making, it extends it, helping students to recognize how understanding is developed through making and felt experience. These reflections are recorded through process journals, as informal annotations, reflective writing, and as documentation of practice. Like action research, these are not linear stages, they are cyclical and recursive modes of practice. Students move continuously between doing, being, and thinking. Together they form an ongoing movement between action, awareness, and reflection, supporting intuitive response, self-awareness, and embodied knowing. The doing, being, and thinking pedagogical model provides students with a shared language for understanding how embodied learning and mindful presence unfolds through practice. Here, making with the hands and mindful engagement are not simply activities to be evaluated. They are forms of inquiry through which students come to understand themselves, their materials, and their creative process. Understanding therefore emerges through participation in practice itself, through the ongoing relationship between action, awareness, and reflection. This approach to pedagogy in creative practice draws on observations of studio dynamics, students' written reflections, and artifacts of creative work. It was observed through previous cohorts and student reflections that students were often operating within patterns shaped by outcome-driven thinking, distraction, and resistance to difficulty, reflecting broader shifts in learning environments where sustained engagement is increasingly challenged. In response, the semester began with a series of reflective practices and intention-setting activities. Students worked through questions such as, why am I here? What is important to me? Where do I thrive? What do I want to achieve? The intention-setting process was informed by research suggesting that goals aligned with an individual's values and sense of self, a concept known as self-concordance, can support focus, motivation, and resilience. Through this process, students reflected on their motivations, values, and aspirations of creative practitioners. Throughout the semester, the statement, why am I here, remained visible within the studio environment, acting as an ongoing point of reference. During one-to-one discussions, students were often invited to consider whether particular decisions or activities aligned with their stated intentions, supporting greater self-awareness and decision-making within practice. Opportunities for structured peer-to-peer discussion were incorporated at key points throughout the semester, enabling students to share work in progress, exchange perspectives, and learn through dialogue with others. Students also reviewed their habitual ways of working in previous projects. From this reflective process, students began to identify where they often placed their attention, and in some instances, previously unacknowledged patterns became visible. One student recognized that despite spending time in the studio, engagement with the work itself was limited. In this way, intention functioned not only as a motivation, but as a means of stabilizing attention within a context of distraction. Statements of purpose were written and pinned within the studio, acting as a visual anchor for attention and intention for the student. Building on this, it became evident that attention needed to be actively structured within the studio environment. Each session began with intention setting. Students were encouraged to identify no more than 3 actions for the session, framed as actions rather than outcomes. These tasks functioned as points of return when attention drifted, reducing overwhelm, supporting momentum, and helping students move through periods of uncertainty or indecision. From lecturer observations and student reflections and discussions, it was acknowledged that the conditions of the space shaped how students engaged with practice. To support this, the studio was reframed as a focused environment for creative work. A separate space for social interaction was set up outside the studio. This allowed the studio to function as a dedicated space for making, where engagement was directed towards the immediacy of practice. Each week also began with a shared discussion of the learning ahead, alongside opportunities for students to identify areas where additional support was needed. These approaches to studio culture and relation helped to establish the studio as a collaborative learning environment while maintaining attention on the work of practice itself. It was also observed that students often attempted to think their way through the brief, resulting in minimal material development. Several weeks into a project, little had been realized materially, only thoughts about making. One student noted, I kept trying to plan the outcome before starting. The work remained conceptual as thinking preceded action. To shift this pattern, making exercises were introduced to move attention from conceptualization to action. The doing and being model modes of engagement were explicitly communicated to students. Students were encouraged to begin with action, the doing, and to refrain from thinking, whilst remaining present and attentive to the task at hand. Students worked quickly with modest materials, reducing caution and outcome-driven thinking. It is in this quick, iterative, experimental making phase that the hand operates as a site of inquiry, generating understanding through movement and material engagement. The emphasis shifts away from predetermined outcomes towards sustained attention. Attention is directed towards the task at hand, returning repeatedly to action rather than anticipated outcomes. It is here that decisions begin to develop through interaction with material rather than preformed ideas. At the end of each studio session, students move into reflective thinking. This time marked a deliberate shift where doing and being emphasized engagement within practice. Reflective thinking provided an opportunity to step back and consider that experience. It was observed that when students were directed to reflect on both internal responses and their engagement with materials, patterns of attention and behavior became more visible. One student noted, "I noticed when I tried to control the outcome." It became evident that when working within the doing, being and thinking model, that conceptual development emerged in dialogue with practice. Ideas were not fully formed before making began. They developed through ongoing engagement with materials. Thinking did not precede making, it developed through it. Making with the hands and mindful engagement are not simply activities to be evaluated. They are forms of inquiry through which understanding emerges. In this sense, learning develops not only through reflection on experience, but through embodied participation in experience itself. While embodied engagement enables students to act and remain present within material processes, reflective writing created the conditions through which these experiences could be recognized and articulated. The process journal operated as a record of this development during shifts in decision-making and material exploration. Importantly, reflective thinking enables students to identify patterns in their behavior. Were they being authentic and following through on their intentions? If not, what needed to change for them to do so and to commit fully to the work, themselves, and the task at hand? Taken together, these examples demonstrate how shifts in intention, attention, action, and reflection contribute to the expansion of creative capacity. This development is not located solely in final outcomes, but in the student's ability to remain present within the process of making, to recognize and work through habitual patterns, and to allow understanding to deepen through experience. It is observed that this capacity is not taught through instruction alone, but cultivated through the conditions of the learning environment, where intention setting, focused task setting, material engagement, and reflective practice support students to remain with uncertainty rather than resolve it prematurely. This framework offers several implications for creative education. First, it suggests that creative capacity develops through sustained engagement with process rather than through thinking or technical instruction alone. Second, it positions teaching itself as a creative and relational practice, where the educator shapes conditions and structures attention, spatial, temporal, and relational, that support embodied engagement. Third, it repositions the studio as a space for doing and being, where students slow down, attend to and remain with the task at hand, and engage more fully with the experience of making. In this way, the role of the educator shifts from directing outcomes towards cultivating the conditions through which learning can emerge. In an era of accelerated technological change and pervasive digital mediation, creative education risks becoming disembodied. This work has argued that restoring embodied intelligence is essential to cultivate designers who are attentive, self-aware, and able to engage meaningfully with uncertainty. The model of doing, being, and thinking offers a clear structure where thinking does not precede making, but emerges through it. Rather than abandoning established studio practices, this framework seeks to retain what remains pedagogically valuable within them, while responding to contemporary conditions of distraction. This is not a rejection of digital tools, but a rebalancing, where embodied relational and sensory engagement is restored alongside technological fluency. In this sense, embodied intelligence, that is to say, creative learning as felt experience, is not supplementary, but is necessary if we are to expand our creative capacity.